Today, we delve into a powerful story about prejudice, forgiveness, and unexpected change. It all begins with Mrs. Evelyn Carter, an elderly black woman with an unwavering faith in God. She is on her way to Atlanta to visit her daughter after many years apart, carrying a coach class ticket in hand. Thanks to the kindness of a young passenger, she is offered a seat in first class, a seemingly simple yet deeply meaningful gesture. However, instead of receiving the respect she deserves, she faces prejudiced and hurtful remarks from Sophia Morgan, a young flight attendant. What Sophia doesn't know is that, in just a few minutes, a series of unexpected events will change everything. Before we dive into this compelling story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you find this story intriguing, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this. Mrs. Evelyn Carter stood quietly at the waiting area of Montgomery Airport in Alabama. With her petite frame and silver-streaked hair, she appeared like any other ordinary passenger. But her hands gently clutched a worn-out Bible, a companion she had kept close for over 40 years. Whenever she faced challenges, she turned to God in prayer, and today was no exception. Mrs. Evelyn was preparing for a special flight that would take her to Atlanta to visit her daughter Angela after years of separation. In her hand was a coach class ticket, a small bag, and her beloved Bible, which she carried as a source of spiritual strength. She paused in the waiting area and settled onto a wooden bench. Around her, the sounds of loudspeaker announcements, hurried footsteps, and rolling suitcases filled the air. But amidst the hustle and bustle, Mrs. Evelyn sat quietly, gently flipping through the pages of her Bible. Her lips moved softly. "Dear Lord, please protect me on this journey. If there are any trials ahead, guide me to keep my faith strong." Not far away, Sophia Morgan, a young flight attendant, was chatting with her colleagues before the flight. With her blonde hair neatly tied up and her uniform perfectly pressed, Sophia exuded confidence and energy. She had been in the job for a few years and took pride in her professionalism. Yet, deep within, Sophia carried prejudices she was unaware of herself. Another fully booked flight, Sophia complained to a colleague. "Economy class is probably going to be packed again. Passengers there always cause trouble." Her older colleague, Lisa, gently reminded her. "Sophia, don't forget that our job is to serve everyone. Don't let prejudices affect the way you work." Sophia gave a forced smile, but deep down, she still harbored a less than favorable attitude toward passengers she deemed unsuitable. As passengers began lining up to board the plane, a well-dressed young white man stood behind Mrs. Evelyn in the queue. Noticing that she seemed a bit tired, he leaned forward and spoke politely. "Ma'am, I have a seat in first class. If you don't mind, I'd like to offer it to you. You'll be much more comfortable there." Mrs. Evelyn looked surprised and turned to the young man with a grateful expression. "Thank you, son, but I don't want to trouble you. Your seat is your seat. I'll be fine wherever I sit." "It's really no trouble at all, ma'am," the young man insisted. "You're older, and the flight might be long. I really want you to be comfortable." Finally, moved by the young man's sincerity, Mrs. Evelyn nodded. "Thank you, young man. May God bless you." The young man quickly informed the flight attendant about his decision. When Sophia was notified, she appeared surprised and subtly observed Mrs. Evelyn from afar. A thought flashed through her mind. How does someone like her end up in first class? Mrs. Evelyn entered the first-class cabin with a hint of hesitation, gently placing her bag down. Eyes turned toward her, some curious, some judgmental. Sophia, standing nearby, stared at her intently. "Ma'am, I need to check your ticket to confirm your seat," Sophia said, her tone polite but slightly stiff. Mrs. Evelyn retrieved her ticket from her small bag and replied calmly, "Here you go, miss. A kind passenger offered me this seat." Sophia glanced at the economy class ticket and furrowed her brow. "Ma'am, according to airline policy, first-class seats cannot be transferred like this. You'll need to return to your original seat in economy." Hearing this, Mrs. Evelyn smiled softly and nodded. "If that's the rule, I'll follow it. I don't want to cause any trouble." But before Mrs. Evelyn could stand, the young man who had given her the seat stepped in and said to Sophia, "Excuse me, miss, but I gave her my seat. It's my decision." Sophia, caught in an awkward situation, maintained her firm tone. "Sir, I understand your goodwill, but rules are rules. If we don't enforce them, everything will get out of hand." Sophia paused for a moment, feeling a wave of discomfort and tension rising inside her. In a moment of frustration, she let slip a remark that immediately sent a chill through the cabin. Someone like her doesn't belong here. Those words cut through the air like a knife. Some passengers widened their eyes in shock at Sophia, while others began whispering to one another. A young black woman named Alicia, sitting nearby, immediately stood up and said loudly, "What did you just say? What exactly do you mean by someone like her?" Another passenger, a middle-aged man, turned to Sophia and added, "This is discrimination. Why would you say that to her?" Sophia, realizing she had just made a grave mistake, tried to explain herself. "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just saying that, according to the rules, the seat can't be transferred." But her words did nothing to calm the situation. A few passengers pulled out their phones and began recording the incident. Mrs. Evelyn, who had been sitting quietly the entire time, gently stood up, her eyes showing no anger. She spoke calmly to Alicia and the other protesting passengers. "Please, everyone, stay calm. I don't want to cause any trouble. If necessary, I'll return to my seat." She began gathering her belongings, but before leaving, she softly placed a hand on Alicia's shoulder and said, "Young lady, don't let anger cloud your heart. The Lord teaches us that love and forgiveness are the true answers." Mrs. Evelyn returned to the economy cabin, leaving a heavy tension hanging over first class. Sophia stood frozen, feeling the weight of every gaze directed at her. Her careless words had crossed a line, and now she had no idea how to make things right. As Mrs. Evelyn returned to her seat in the economy cabin, the incident in first class continued to stir a quiet wave of outrage. Some passengers kept whispering to each other, and disapproving glances still followed Sophia wherever she went. In economy, Mrs. Evelyn sat down, placing her bag gently on her lap. A young black woman sitting next to her, Alicia, turned to her with an angry expression. "Ma'am, why do you have to put up with that? She had no right to say those things to you." Mrs. Evelyn turned to Alicia, her eyes calm and kind. "Young lady, don't let anger take over your heart. The Lord always has his way of lighting the path. I don't want anyone else to be hurt because of this." But Alicia couldn't hold back her frustration. She pulled out her phone and said to Mrs. Evelyn, "If you won't speak up for yourself, then I'll do it for you." Alicia opened her phone's video app and began recording, her voice full of emotion. "This is Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a dignified woman who was just treated unfairly on this flight. A flight attendant said, 'Someone like her doesn't belong here. This is unacceptable. We need justice for her, and we need to end discrimination like this.'" She posted the video with the hashtags Justice for Evelyn and Airline Racism. Within minutes, the video started gaining traction. Thanks to the plane's Wi-Fi, hundreds of people shared and commented on it. Another passenger sitting near Alicia, after watching the video, leaned over and whispered, "This is blowing up. By the time we land, there's going to be a storm." Meanwhile, in first class, Sophia stood behind the galley area, trying to collect herself. She could feel the atmosphere on the plane had shifted dramatically. The judgmental stares, the murmurs of passengers, and even the silent pressure from her own colleagues, all of it was weighing heavily on her. The flight manager, Lisa Reynolds, approached and pulled Sophia aside, addressing her directly. "Sophia, what just happened? I heard you said something to that elderly woman in first class. Do you realize how serious the consequences of your words could be?" Sophia stammered, trying to explain herself. "I was just following the rules, Lisa. I didn't mean anything by it." Lisa frowned. "The rules don't allow you to insult any passenger. If you really said those words, this is no longer a small issue." Sophia felt her chest tighten. She looked around, and for the first time in a long while, a feeling she rarely experienced began to creep in: guilt. In the economy cabin, Mrs. Evelyn opened her Bible, closed her eyes, and began to pray. The passengers around her, though not directly involved in the confrontation, could feel the peace radiating from her. A passenger sitting across from her, a middle-aged man, leaned over and said, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for what you just went through. You didn't deserve that." Mrs. Evelyn responded gently, "Thank you, son, but I've already forgiven her. We're all human, and anyone can make mistakes." The man was taken aback by her kindness. However, other passengers nearby still appeared visibly upset. While the plane remained in the air, the video Alicia had posted racked up thousands of views and quickly became a trending topic on social media. Outraged comments flooded in. "I can't believe this is still happening in this day and age. We need to take action to end racism. Who is that flight attendant? She needs to be fired immediately. The hashtag Justice for Evelyn quickly climbed to the top of Twitter's trending list, with many public figures starting to share the story. Sensing the growing dissatisfaction among the passengers, Lisa decided to make an announcement over the intercom. Dear passengers, we sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced during this flight. The airline will review all passenger feedback after we land. Thank you for your understanding. However, this announcement did little to calm the situation. Some passengers, including Alicia, continued to express their anger. Back in the galley, Sophia sat down in a chair, her head spinning. She couldn't stop replaying the words she had spoken. Someone like her doesn't belong here. Those words echoed in her mind, weighing on her chest like a heavy stone. For the first time, Sophia realized that, even though she hadn't intended it, her words had deeply hurt an innocent person. What have I done? How did things go so wrong, she asked herself, her eyes welling with tears. The plane tilted slightly as the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We are about to land at Atlanta International Airport. The announcement seemed to mark the end of the tension in the air. But for Sophia, everything was just beginning. In the economy cabin, Mrs. Evelyn sat quietly next to her small bag, her hands resting on her worn Bible. No one would have guessed that this woman had been at the center of a deeply troubling incident on the flight. She did not complain, nor did she show any anger, but her calm demeanor only deepened the empathy of those around her. Alicia, sitting next to her, was still unable to contain her anger. She checked her phone and saw that the video she had posted had already garnered thousands of shares and comments. Mrs. Evelyn shouldn't have to endure this, she thought. As the plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate, the heavy atmosphere on board lingered. The passengers felt as though they were part of something larger, a story that the public would not let go unnoticed. When the plane's doors opened, passengers began filing out with their luggage. But unlike usual, a large crowd of reporters was already waiting in the terminal. Cameras, video recorders, and microphones were raised everywhere, pointed at the passengers as they exited. What's going on, Sophia thought, a rising sense of dread tightening her chest. She stepped off the plane quickly, trying to maintain her composure, but several passengers pointed in her direction. That's the flight attendant who said those things to the elderly woman, one person said loudly. She's the one who insulted Mrs. Evelyn, Alicia shouted, holding up her phone to live stream the moment. Reporters immediately swarmed Mrs. Evelyn, who had just stepped off the plane with her usual humble demeanor. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession as a barrage of questions came flying her way. Mrs. Evelyn, are you planning to sue the airline? How do you feel about being treated so unfairly? What do you think about the flight attendant's comments? Mrs. Evelyn paused, her bright eyes looking calmly at the crowd. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gently raised her Bible as though drawing strength from it. After a brief moment of silence, she spoke in a warm, steady voice. I don't hate her. I believe we all have moments of weakness when we might say or do the wrong thing. I only hope that we can treat each other with the love and respect that God teaches us. Mrs. Evelyn's words left the reporters stunned. Some lowered their microphones, their expressions shifting from curiosity to deep emotion. But outside the terminal, the public's outrage continued to boil over, refusing to be calmed as easily as Mrs. Evelyn's forgiving heart. Sophia couldn't bring herself to meet anyone's eyes. She hurried through the terminal, but the words and whispers of the passengers followed her like daggers piercing her heart. She doesn't deserve to be a flight attendant. She's a racist. How is this still happening in this day and age? When she finally arrived at her small apartment, Sophia slammed the door shut, leaned against the wall, and let out a heavy breath. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her pocket, but she didn't have the courage to check it. When she finally summoned enough strength to turn it on, the flood of notifications overwhelmed her screen. Alicia had posted another video, this time capturing the moment Mrs. Evelyn spoke to reporters with calmness and grace. Instead of diffusing the public's anger, however, it only fueled the outrage even further. She's so gracious. But that doesn't mean the flight attendant shouldn't face consequences. This airline needs to act immediately. Sophia dropped her phone onto the table and buried her face in her hands. For the first time in her life, she felt her entire career and reputation hanging by a thread. But what haunted her the most wasn't the angry comments or accusations, it was Mrs. Evelyn's eyes. They weren't filled with anger or resentment, but with forgiveness and a message that Sophia still couldn't fully comprehend. Meanwhile, at Angela's home, Mrs. Evelyn's daughter, the incident had sparked a heated debate. Angela, a young lawyer, was furious after hearing the story from her mother. "Mom, this can't just end like this. That flight attendant needs to be held accountable, and the airline should face responsibility. I'll help you file a lawsuit," Angela said, her eyes burning with determination. But Mrs. Evelyn simply smiled and gently replied, "My daughter, I don't want to file a lawsuit. God teaches us that forgiveness is stronger than hatred. If I sue them, will it bring me peace?" Angela frowned, clearly disagreeing. "Mom, you're too kind. But don't you think forgiving them will make them believe they don't need to change?" Mrs. Evelyn placed her hand over her daughter's and spoke in a calm, steady voice that carried the weight of wisdom. "Forgiving doesn't mean accepting injustice, but creating an opportunity for change. Instead of destroying someone's life, I want us to use this story to spread a greater lesson. God will guide us." Angela sighed deeply, unable to argue further against her mother's serenity and compassion. That night, as everyone else slept, Sophia sat alone in her dark room, staring at a blank sheet of paper in front of her. She wanted to write an apology letter to Mrs. Evelyn, but the words wouldn't come. "How can I ever make up for what I've done?" she thought, her hands trembling as she picked up the pen. Finally, she began to write, "Dear Mrs. Evelyn, I don't even know where to start except to say that I am truly sorry. My words on that flight were not only thoughtless but deeply hurtful to you. I have no excuse, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope you can believe that I am trying to change. I would be grateful for the chance to speak with you, to learn from you, and to better understand what I failed to see. I am deeply sorry and full of regret. With all sincerity, Sophia Morgan." When she finished, Sophia folded the letter and placed it into an envelope. She didn't know if Mrs. Evelyn would ever accept her apology, but this was the first step she knew she had to take. That morning, soft sunlight poured into Mrs. Evelyn's small house in Montgomery. She sat on a wooden chair by the window, her familiar Bible resting on her lap, when Angela walked in holding an envelope. "Mom, there's a letter for you. No return address, but it looks like it's from the airline." Angela placed the envelope on the table. Mrs. Evelyn picked up her reading glasses and carefully opened the letter. Inside, the handwriting was neat but slightly shaky. It was a letter from Sophia. Mrs. Evelyn read each line slowly. By the time she reached the end, her eyes glistened with tears, not from anger or sadness, but from feeling the sincerity and remorse in every word. Angela, standing nearby, couldn't hide her frustration. Her again. "Do you think a simple apology is enough, Mom? A letter won't change anything. She humiliated you in front of everyone." But Mrs. Evelyn placed the letter on the table and looked at Angela with calm eyes. "My daughter, I can feel the sincerity in her apology. No one is perfect. We all make mistakes. What matters is whether someone is willing to change." Angela crossed her arms, frowning. "But what are you going to do?" "Just forgive her without holding her accountable." Mrs. Evelyn smiled gently and took Angela's hand. "Forgiveness isn't about freeing someone else, it's about finding peace for yourself. I don't want anyone to suffer because of past mistakes. If she truly wants to make amends, I will give her that chance." 2 days later, Sophia stood in front of Mrs. Evelyn's gate. In her hands were a bouquet of white flowers and a new Bible, a gift she had carefully chosen after many sleepless nights. She stood there for a long moment, her hand trembling as she held the small iron gate, uncertain if she should go in. Finally, she gathered her courage and knocked softly on the wooden door. When the door opened, Mrs. Evelyn appeared small in stature but radiating kindness. Sophia bowed her head, her eyes red and filled with tears. "Hello, ma'am. I'm Sophia. I'm here to apologize to you in person for what I did and for what I said. I'm truly sorry." Mrs. Evelyn looked at Sophia for a long moment, saying nothing. Then she smiled and gently opened the door wider. "Come in, young lady. We have much to talk about." Sophia sat on a small wooden chair, her hands clasped together, her head bowed like a child who had been caught doing something wrong. She began recounting the entire story from her perspective, from the words she had said to the guilt that had haunted her ever since that day. I tried to justify it by saying I was just following the rules, but deep down I know that I let my own prejudices take over. I didn't realize it until it was too late. You did nothing wrong, yet I hurt you, and I will never be able to forgive myself." Sophia choked up, tears falling onto her trembling hands. She looked up at Mrs. Evelyn, her eyes filled with a plea for mercy. You have no reason to forgive me. But I hope that you'll give me the chance to make things right." Mrs. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She gazed at Sophia, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. Finally, she placed her hand gently over Sophia's, her voice warm and steady. "Young lady, I forgave you a long time ago. God teaches us that anyone can make mistakes. What matters isn't what you've done, but what you've learned from it. And I believe God placed this trial in your path so you could find the right way forward." Sophia looked at her, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small sense of relief in her heart. After their conversation, Mrs. Evelyn said to Sophia, "Young lady, if you truly want to change, you need to turn your remorse into action. I don't need anything from you, but I hope you'll find a way to use this story to help others." Sophia nodded, her voice resolute. "I will. I don't want my apology to just be empty words. I want to live better, and I want to help fix what's been wrong." Mrs. Evelyn smiled, her eyes full of hope. "Young lady, God has already forgiven you. Live with faith in Him, and let Him guide your path." Sophia returned to her job, but with a completely new perspective. She asked to be involved in the airline's volunteer programs, particularly those aimed at raising awareness about cultural respect and equality. At a community event organized by a charity, Sophia stood in front of the audience and shared her story. "I made a big mistake. But thanks to Mrs. Evelyn, I've learned that our mistakes don't define us. What defines us is how we choose to make things right. I hope my story serves as a reminder that we need to see each other with our hearts, not through our prejudices." Sophia's words were met with applause and support. She was no longer just the flight attendant who caused trouble, but someone actively working to do what was right. As for Mrs. Evelyn, she continued her simple life, but her story with Sophia spread far and wide. From time to time, Sophia would visit Mrs. Evelyn. They would sit on the porch, talking for hours about life, faith, and the good that people are capable of doing for one another. One day, Sophia said to Mrs. Evelyn, "I used to think that your forgiveness was impossible. But now I understand that forgiving me didn't just help me, it made your life lighter too. I thank you for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget." Mrs. Evelyn smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "Young lady, we are all still learning, and you've taught me that even when we make mistakes, God still has a good plan for us." The story of Mrs. Evelyn and Sophia, shared through social media and the press, did not stop at the fateful flight or the small house in Montgomery. Videos capturing their conversations, especially the moment when Mrs. Evelyn calmly spoke about forgiveness, touched the hearts of millions around the world. One of the most widely shared videos featured Mrs. Evelyn's words from a recent interview. "Forgiveness is not weakness, it is the strength to free yourself from the burden of hatred. I forgave Sophia not because she deserved it, but because I believe everyone deserves a chance to change." The video quickly went viral, garnering millions of views and hundreds of thousands of comments. Many people shared that Mrs. Evelyn's story had changed their perspective on forgiveness and compassion. An elderly woman in New York commented, "Mrs. Evelyn reminds me of my mother, who always taught me that God loves us all, even when we make mistakes." A young white man in California wrote, "I've had biases like Sophia without even realizing it. This story made me take a hard look at myself and how I treat others." The story didn't stop with words. A movement emerged from it, the Live with Grace initiative, encouraging people to forgive, empathize, and see one another with open hearts. Sophia didn't stop at simply apologizing or changing herself. After receiving forgiveness from Mrs. Evelyn, she became determined to turn her story into a lesson that could help others. She reached out to a nonprofit organization called Bridges of Understanding, which focuses on promoting racial equality and building connections between communities. Sophia volunteered and was soon tasked with organizing sessions to share her personal story to educate employee groups, especially those in the service industry. During a discussion at a school in Atlanta, Sophia stood in front of a group of students and shared her story. "I made a huge mistake. But what hurt me even more was realizing that my mistake came from biases I didn't even know I had. I said something I should never have said, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But thanks to Mrs. Evelyn's forgiveness, I've learned that we always have the chance to change, and change starts with admitting our mistakes." Sophia's words moved many in the audience. One student stood up and asked, "Do you think everyone deserves to be forgiven?" Sophia paused for a moment, then answered, "Not everyone wants to change, but everyone deserves the chance to." What I've learned from Mrs. Evelyn is that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting what's wrong, it means opening the door for us to work together to make things right. While Sophia threw herself into volunteer activities, Mrs. Evelyn was not idle either. With Angela's help, she began participating in talks at churches and small community gatherings, where she shared her story and the message of forgiveness. One Sunday morning, in a crowded church in Atlanta, Mrs. Evelyn stepped up to the pulpit. Standing before hundreds of attentive eyes, she opened her Bible and read aloud, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." This is not just a verse in the Bible, it has been the guiding principle of my life. She looked up, her voice warm but resolute. When we are hurt, our first instinct is to seek revenge. But that is not what God teaches us. He teaches that love and forgiveness are the path to healing the world. I did not forgive Sophia because she did the right thing. I forgave her because I believe God wanted me to open the door for her to find her way back. Those words brought tears to the eyes of many in the congregation. After the service, an elderly woman approached Mrs. Evelyn, took her hand, and said, "I've held a grudge against my sister-in-law for 10 years. Today, I'm going to call her. You've changed the way I think about forgiveness." One day, Sophia and Mrs. Evelyn were invited to speak together at a large conference on equality and human rights. Standing on stage, the two shared their story with thousands of attendees. Sophia spoke first, her voice filled with emotion. "If it weren't for Mrs. Evelyn, I don't know where I would be today. Her forgiveness not only changed my life but also taught me that we are all responsible for what we say and do, even when it's unintentional. This story isn't just about me or Mrs. Evelyn. It's about all of us, about how we treat one another." Then Mrs. Evelyn stepped forward, her kind eyes sweeping across the audience. "Our story began with a mistake. But mistakes are not the worst thing in life. The worst thing is when we fail to learn from them. If this story can change even one heart, then everything we've been through was worth it." The entire audience rose to their feet in applause, many unable to hold back their tears. After the conference, Sophia and Mrs. Evelyn sat together in a quiet room. Sophia turned to her and spoke softly. "I don't just see you as someone who forgave me. I see you as a friend, as a teacher. Thank you for everything." Mrs. Evelyn took Sophia's hand and smiled. "Young lady, God brought us together not for me to teach you, but for both of us to learn from each other. You've shown me that mistakes don't define a person, it's how we choose to fix them that truly matters." The two sat in silence for a while, feeling the peace and connection between two souls that once seemed so far apart. The story of Mrs. Evelyn and Sophia became a symbol far greater than themselves. No one could have imagined that a tense moment on a flight would spark a social movement promoting kindness, forgiveness, and the importance of treating one another with open hearts. The Live with Grace movement, inspired by their story, organized numerous events in schools, workplaces, and community organizations. A key part of the movement was hosting workshops where people could discuss prejudice, ways to overcome differences, and how to build compassion in society. Sophia was invited as the keynote speaker at many of these workshops. At one session with service industry employees, she said, "My story began with a mistake. But thanks to Mrs. Evelyn's forgiveness and kindness, I realized that a mistake is not the end. It's how we choose to fix our mistakes that defines who we are." Mrs. Evelyn, despite her age, continued to actively participate in talks at churches and community gatherings. During a service at a small church, she shared her message with the congregation. "If someone hurts you, remember that hatred will never heal anything. Forgiveness doesn't just free the other person, it also frees you. Let God guide you through your trials, for He always has a good plan for all of us." Her words didn't just move those who listened, they also inspired people to change themselves. The story didn't stop at words, it also brought about real, tangible changes. After the incident on the fateful flight, the airline introduced a series of mandatory training programs on equality and communication for all employees, from flight attendants to executives. These sessions not only emphasized compliance with policies but also encouraged employees to learn empathy and respect for customers from different cultural backgrounds. The airline's management acknowledged in an interview the story of Mrs. Evelyn and Ms. Sophia taught us a valuable lesson that rules should never take precedence over compassion. We are committed to creating an environment of respect and equality for everyone. At churches and local communities, the story became a living lesson. Many people shared that they had let go of long-standing grudges and disputes after hearing Mrs. Evelyn's words. A middle-aged man, who had been estranged from his best friend for 20 years, came to a church to apologize and mend their friendship. He shared, "When I heard Mrs. Evelyn talk about forgiveness, I realized that I needed to free myself too. Forgiveness isn't just for others, it's also for yourself." The story of Mrs. Evelyn and Sophia even transcended the borders of the United States. A nonprofit organization in Europe, inspired by the Live with Grace movement, launched a campaign to help immigrants and local residents learn about and understand one another through community activities. 1 year after the fateful flight, Sophia decided to organize a special event to honor Mrs. Evelyn and spread their message even further. The event, titled The Journey of Forgiveness, brought together hundreds of people from different backgrounds, races, and religions. Standing on the stage, holding a microphone with slightly trembling hands, Sophia's eyes shone with determination. "I used to think that my mistake was the worst thing that could have happened to me. But now I know that mistake was the beginning of a journey I will cherish for the rest of my life. Mrs. Evelyn taught me that even when we fall, we can still get up and walk a better path." Sophia turned toward Mrs. Evelyn, who was seated in the front row. Their eyes met, and Sophia bowed deeply. "Thank you, not only for forgiving me, but for helping me find my way." Mrs. Evelyn slowly stepped onto the stage to a thunderous applause. Despite her age, she carried herself with strength and grace. She looked out over the audience, her voice gentle but powerful. "I am not a special person. I am just a woman who has learned to trust in God and the love He wants us to share. If our story, mine and Sophia's, can change even one person, then it's thanks to the power of forgiveness. We don't need to be perfect, but we do need to be kind to one another." The audience erupted into applause. Everyone rose to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes. After the event, Sophia and Mrs. Evelyn sat together on a wooden bench in the small garden behind Mrs. Evelyn's house. Sophia looked at her, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I never could have imagined that from a mistake I would find a friend like you. You've changed my life." Mrs. Evelyn smiled warmly, placing her hand over Sophia's. "And you've changed mine too. God always has His plans, Sophia. He brought us together not to judge one another, but to learn from one another." The two sat in silence for a while, feeling the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves. They didn't need to say anything more, because both of them knew that their bond was more than just a story, it was a living testament to the power of kindness and forgiveness. The story of Mrs. Evelyn and Sophia is not just a journey of forgiveness, but also a powerful reminder that kindness, empathy, and change start with each of us. Let this story inspire you. Treat others with an open heart. Have the courage to admit your mistakes, and always believe that God has a beautiful plan for us all. If this story touched your heart, please share it to spread the message of compassion and forgiveness to even more people. And don't forget to hit subscribe to our channel to keep receiving meaningful, inspiring stories like this. Your support is our motivation to continue spreading positive values to the community.